Good evening. You're listening to Rainbow Radio. This is In My Humble Opinion. I'm your host, Nice Guy Eddie. This week we pick up our conversation where we left off last week with best-selling feminist author Clementine Ford. It's almost a little bit funny to say what we were talking about, where we had to cut it off last week, because of course we were talking about patriarchy. But we were right in the middle of a conversation where we were digging into toxic masculinity and patriarchy. So we're going to pick up where we left off. This is best-selling author Clementine Ford.
Well, it's because patriarchy, one of the things that patriarchy, and a lot of this stuff is like, it's that old cartoon of like two fish swimming in the water, and one fish mentions the water, how's the water today? And the fish is like, what's water? Because we're swimming in patriarchy. A lot of people, like when you're born into a system, you live and breathe it. It's not visible to a lot of people, but It is noticeable once you start kind of clocking the ways in which it consigns people and co-opts people into perpetuating it. You know, if I thought that all masculinity was toxic, I wouldn't say toxic masculinity. I'd say masculinity.
Exactly.
I don't believe that all masculinity is toxic. I believe that patriarchy, in order to preserve its own power, patriarchy weaponizes certain things against men that are toxic and that are harmful towards other people and harmful towards men themselves. You know, I look at my child. As you said, I wrote the final chapter of Boys Will Be Boys as a letter to my son. And it's a wish really for what I want for him in the world. You know, I don't want him to grow up feeling like he can't express his feelings because someone will say that he's gay or he's a sissy, or apply perceptibly feminine traits to him in order to emasculate him, because of course the worst thing that a man can be is like a woman. You know, I don't want him to think that, I don't want him to feel depressed about, I don't want him to slip into a depression that he feels like he can't seek help for. I don't want my son to kill himself. I don't want him to hurt anyone else. I don't want him to be in a group of boys one day who he feels like he doesn't have the power to stand up against and end up, you know, this is the thing, like one of those chapters is about rape culture and is about actual rape that normal, ordinary boys have perpetrated amongst each other. We know that those stories exist. Yeah. What makes those boys any different from any other group of teenage or young men in America? What is it that motivates them? How do you get to a situation where a group of boys who go to school together could say to each other, let's sexually assault this girl and film it, and then share that video around? Those are normal boys. They come from good families. You know, they have people who love them. They do good things in their community. And they also did this thing. So how do we stop that from happening? Because I don't want, in as much as people don't want their daughters to grow up to be harmed by male violence, I don't want my son to grow up to perpetrate it. Yeah. And I can't accept that the mistake that we make is that we think that the only way to address that is by putting girls on guard all the time and saying that they need to modify their behavior, and assuming that our boys will never be victims of patriarchy and therefore perpetrators of it. I can't take that chance. No. And none of us should feel like we can take that chance.
Right. And it goes from not all men to it doesn't happen to we know what boys are like. And it's like, well, wait a minute, which is it? Because you can't have all that. I caught a video of yours recently on Facebook about flipping the script. And it's interesting that you talk about your son. You talk about, I don't want him to go through, I don't want him to be pressured to do things like this. But you talk about women who are like, God, I wouldn't want to, I'm so afraid of my son because he can't say things, he can't do things.
Eddie here on playback. I realize a little context is needed there. What they're referring to is that mothers were expressing fears for their sons being able to say or do things due to a pervasive attitude of political correctness or the after effects of the Me Too movement.
These days, and you talk about flipping the script on him, like, well, what is it that he can't say? What is it that he can't do exactly? What are you so afraid of? Like you kind of validate the feeling, but then ask, okay, what is it all about? And of course, they don't really have an answer because it's kind of bullshit. But I think of this was brilliant. When my wife met my parents for the first time, and my ex-wife and my parents did not get along. My dad is one of those alpha guys with the really big personalities, okay? Businessman, manager type, we all know him. He's the guy that fills up the room. She could not deal with that. She's an introvert. She was smaller, and they just could not get along. Well, my wife now, when she first met him, and he slipped into something about how he wouldn't want to be in college today. Back when we didn't have that whole Me Too movement and all that. And I wondered what was going to happen that moment. And she just looks at him and with the most innocent voice was just like, well, my God, what were you doing to those poor girls? And she said it that pleasantly. And I have never seen this man put on the defensive in so effectively, and yet in such a way that he could not feel like he was attacked. Like that was so, the script was flipped so beautifully. And it was like, oh my God. And some people can do that.
I like your wife.
Yeah. I think you would. That's why I was recommending your book to her. But so far, but yeah, it was just, and I'm just sitting here going like, I've never seen anyone do that to him, and he actually respected her more, like by the end of the whole conversation, because it didn't become an argument. It got flipped on him. He was just like, I don't know, boys will be boys. But it was.
Well, I mean, that's the thing. Is like when people, and that's why I named that second book "Boys Will Be Boys," because again, going back to this idea that as a feminist, the ways in which feminism is discredited is, of course, by saying that feminism is an attack against men, whereas feminism seeks to liberate men in as much as it seeks to liberate women. Feminism doesn't want men to be harmed in the world. Feminism doesn't want men to be perpetrators of violence. It's looking to solve that and to save them from that. But when people say things like "boys will be boys," what are they saying?
Yeah, exactly.
What do you mean by that?
Exactly.
What is locker room talk? What is it that you, as you said, what is it that you feel like you can't say? Like, let's create a safe space. You can say it to me. What do you feel like you can't say in the world? Tell me all of the racist, sexist, transphobic, homophobic things that you want to say. Tell me right now.
Right. Well, and
because that must be it.
Yeah. Well, yeah. Right. I mean, it's like, we all know they want to say the N word, we it's like, but really, like, well, this is what's interesting to me too, because you getting back to the first book, because I wanted to ask you something about this. The word brave is often thrown about somewhat pedantically, somewhat condescendingly, but as I was reading, especially the first half of Fight Like a Girl, I'm thinking you were very brave in writing this, because you put out what is this experience that you had that obviously hurt. Obviously, you carried that with you for a long time. It took time to process. Trauma, maybe a word to use. But what struck me, I was struck by two things as I was reading it. One, if you'll forgive me for saying it this way, but I think this is the only way I can say it. You were not talking about surviving a rape. You were not talking about ritual sexual abuse. So you were not talking even about physical or verbal abuse in the overt way. You were describing your upbringing. It was painfully ordinary. It was, and in that way, I mean, it was the universal experience of girls. And yet, in spite of a critic, you are bearing your soul and essentially exposing the soft underbelly to the world. And I can just imagine all the critics descending, those who, don't just call you an unfuckable, ugly, blah, 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 blah. Basically dismissing it, saying all she's doing is just describing things that every girl experiences. And it's like, well, yeah, but when you lay it all out like that, it's pretty horrifying. Because it was none of this was stuff that you can deny. None of this was stuff that doesn't happen. But when it's all laid out like that, it's like, oh my God, this is horrible. I can't imagine living like this. And then you come to the realization this is what every girl experiences. Like,
it's interesting that unless you have, I've been very fortunate in my life sexually. I think I'm actually in the minority of women in that I've never been raped, and I've never been raped yet. That's always something you kind of have to consider, Right. But it's interesting because in the paperback release of Fight Like a Girl in Australia, I included an essay that's not in the American version because the American version came out a little bit earlier than the second release of it. And it's an essay on Me Too and about all the different experiences that I've had in my life.
Right.
And I realized when I was writing it that I've never been raped, but because I'd never had that particular experience, I dismissed every other incidence of sexual assault and harassment that I'd ever been exposed to, starting from when I was 9 years old.
Right.
And so I would always say, oh, well, I've never been, I've been really lucky. This has never happened to me. But then I realized when I was writing this essay that all of these different things, I mean, that kind of to me is even more illustrative that I was able to write a list of things, starting from an old man that my parents were friends with. It was a New Year's Eve party, and it was a room full of people surrounded, and I was 9 years old, and it was New Year's Eve, and just in the midst of this crowd of people, because if you do things, you hide it in sight, and he just like grabbed me and kissed me with his like big wet lips right over my mouth, and I was a child. And I remembered that. I still remember it now, and I don't feel, weirdly, I mean, it's a weird thing to talk about because I don't feel traumatized by it, but I remember it.
Yeah.
And isn't it reflective of the society that we live in, that I can, as a 9-year-old girl, say, well, an adult man who must have been at least 70 wrapped his wet fish lips around mine in a room full of people, but because I've never been raped, it's not that bad.
Right.
Like we shouldn't be accepting scenarios. And of course you can't, the heartbreaking thing is that these things will happen.
Yeah.
To, children suffer immeasurable violence. And if you think too closely about how powerless you are against it, then your heart will just shatter into a million pieces. But we shouldn't be sort of saying, particularly not of girls, oh, well, it's not that big a deal. It's not that big a deal.
Right.
It's not that big a deal that a man, like when I was 13, my boss, I've written about this in my new book, actually, which is not so much a feminist polemic in that it's a collection of life essays.
Yes.
Yeah. But when I was 13, I worked for a guy great boss, so fun, so charming, also groomed me. And it became very close to, statutory. Well, how even at 13, it would have been very bad. Let's just put it like that. And I would have been co-opted into feeling like it was my fault.
Sure.
And luckily it didn't, well, if you read the book, then you'll see what happened. But luckily it didn't quite get that far. But, you amass all of these experiences and you say, actually, what I've had is a lot of really lucky escapes. And a lot of other women and children are not that lucky.
Right.
But we shouldn't be viewing lucky escapes as nothing happened.
Right. Oh yeah. That's a good point. Huh. Were your when the book came out, Fight Like a Girl, were your parents alive? Did they read it?
My dad's alive, but my mum died about 14 years ago. So she hasn't read it. My dad did read it. And
what did he think of it? Because you kind of call them out a little bit. And it's like, and it goes into that whole, well, it's not that bad kind of a thing. But as I say, as you read it, it seems really like, what was how did he react to what you had to say about that?
My dad we disagree on things politically, a lot of political stuff, but I have to say that it's really funny that people say one of the things that feminists get dismissed with all the time is, of course, you've got daddy issues. Now, firstly, you could say, if my dad, I'm not talking about my dad here, but if a woman could say my dad was a piece of shit who abandoned me or who like abused me or mocked me or ridiculed me or never championed me, and you're going to turn around and still going to further mock me by saying I've got daddy issues rather than saying, wow, it sucks that your dad was a piece of shit. Right. Why don't we say men have daughter issues? Like men have daughter issues every time they're like, well, I'm going to lock her up in her room so that no man touches her. Like, that's weird. One thing I will say about my dad is that he has always really championed me, even if he doesn't agree with me politically on things. He's pretty like solid on like supporting, he's very kind of classic. He's not ever going to march in a feminist march. And he would probably, he's 70 years old. He'd probably dismiss certain groups of women. He certainly has made me feel in my life that women need to look a certain way in order to have some kind of value.
And to be fair, that's a product of the upbringing that has been going on since biblical times or since the dinosaurs. So it's not, but let's be clear that even in the book, you're not calling him out personally. You're using the examples of your upbringing as the kinds of things that are universal, but it's still, I know from personal experience, people don't like being called that.
No, but he's always been really a real strong advocate for his daughters using their voices. Even when he's disagreed with me, I know that he's been proud of me. Even when he's like personally hated that I'm arguing with him, he's always been really proud of a daughter that is strong-minded. I feel like in lots of ways that has actually been one of the things that I say to men now if they have daughters is don't seek to protect them from the world. You have to empower them to fight in the world. Yeah. You have to empower them to protect and defend themselves. And I don't mean defend themselves with a gun. I mean like stand up for themselves and not be afraid of male disapproval.
Yeah.
You know, you have to teach them to find strength in themselves, because that's one of the things that my dad did do really well, was that he really believed in his daughters. And, you know, I feel like, so he read the book and he wrote to me and he said, I finished your book. It was wonderful. I've learned so many new things about you.
Wow.
And it was really validating. And he's been, you know, he went to my book launches, and he's been a pretty huge champion. Even if he doesn't agree with everything I say, he's like, I love that you're out there saying it.
That's awesome. That's awesome. So, well, now, and I got to ask you something about the flip side of that, because anybody familiar with your work, anybody that follows you on Facebook, has Twitter, has read the books, you know, you get your share of online hate a little bit from time to time. And
I sometimes give it back too. You know, look, there's been things that I've said that I'm not proud of, and I'm sure that when you share this, people will be like, she's the woman who said the coronavirus isn't killing enough men.
Oh my, wait. Put a pin in that. I got to come back to that. I got to come back to that one. But I'm curious, before I do that, so the reaction, I know the reaction to your work is universally, well, not universally, from that side, the critics, it's generally speaking pretty pig-headed, pretty ignorant, pretty abusive, death threats, rape threats. I mean, you described one was something in the book about your vagina being the size of a shipping container. I don't know. There was a whole lot. I mean, it's just like, oh my God. But I'm curious when this
I'm a huge slut who can't get laid.
Exactly. So I'm curious when this first came out, because you'd mentioned you'd been writing already for many years at that point. What was was that negative reaction immediate? Was it already old hat by then? Like, at what point in your life did you start getting that kind of visceral, violent, threatening kind of response from people who'd read your work? And like, was there a moment where you're just like, oh shit, like, what the hell is this all about? Or, I mean, tell me a bit about that process. Because, you know,
it's sort of, by the time the book came out, I'd been so used to it because I was an online columnist for a newspaper, and I wrote feminist articles. So of course, I'd get emails saying, oh, you only care about rape because you're too ugly to rape. It's always the ugly ones who rant about rape. Don't worry, love, no one would ever rape you. Which is also very kind of like, I mean, I don't think one of the mistakes that we make is people saying, oh, those aren't real men. You know, those aren't real men who would say that. A real man does this. It's like, no, they are real men. That's the problem, is that there's no such thing as a real man and not a real. I get the idea of like the stoic, noble kind of guy. Right. But in lots of respects, these men would be considered by their communities to be really stand-up guys.
Right, because nobody talks it's more layered like that. Than that. Nobody talks like that in real life. You know, you would get.
But these people have jobs. They've got families. Yeah. We know that trolls often have very normal lives. They're not like, we make jokes about men being in their basements, but that's not the entirety of it. Right. So when I was 27, I got my first newspaper columnist job, and I wrote. It was a conservative newspaper in Adelaide, where I lived in South Australia at the time, and I wrote about abortion. And I wrote, I've had 2 abortions. Every woman you know almost will have either thought about having an abortion or has had an abortion. And a lot of them keep it secret because of the incredible backlash that comes from it. You know, 1 in 3 women has an abortion. So it's not almost every woman that you know, but 1 in 3 women statistically that we know of, and that's the ones that are admitting to it, you know? Yeah. So I wrote about having 2 abortions, but the difference was that I didn't say they were the hardest decision I've ever made in my life. You know, I still think about them every day. I said, because the previous week, the reason I wrote about it was because something had happened to do with abortion legislation or something like that. And I was like, I've had 2. I'm not ashamed of them. I'm proud of the choice that I made. I live in a place where it was legal for me to make that choice, and I was supported by my friends and family to do it. And I know that I couldn't have become a parent this young. I didn't have a supportive partner. And people were like, well, 1 abortion is fine, but 2, that's just irresponsible. And you're like, well, I can't control how fertile I am. Sorry. You know, it was like, but the other thing as well was that I didn't describe the circumstances under which I got pregnant, because everyone's always like, well, this happened, or the contraception failed, or whatever. And as far as I'm concerned, if you support abortion, which everyone should, because no one should be forced to carry a baby to term if they don't want to, or carry a fetus,
Right.
No one should be forced to become a parent, particularly when they can't afford to become a parent. Then there's no hierarchy of like morality over how those choices get made.
Exactly.
Either you believe that women have that, or that people have that option, or you don't. And really, my personal medical decisions are no one else's business. The only reason that I wrote about it was because, of course, we have the very great need to continue destigmatizing this, because so many women are made to feel so ashamed about it.
Right.
So, and also men benefit from abortion. Men benefit from women making those choices because they're not forced to become fathers.
Well, and they complain, these same men that will be pro-life will also complain about having to pay paternity suits and child support and all of that.
Exactly.
So,
yeah, but then, we'll just keep your legs closed. Okay, well then why won't you have sex with him? You'll never keep him if you don't have sex with him. Like it's the shifting goalposts again.
Absolutely.
There is no way to win the game. The game is rigged.
Yeah.
So that was back when I was 27, and I wrote that, and I was very new to the game. And in my favor, I was also young and cocky, and I was like, I've got a fucking column, So and I had total faith in what I was writing.
Yeah.
And I was being probably slightly provocative with it, so I was expecting the backlash. And I found actually that when it came, I wasn't shocked by it.
Okay.
And because I so fervently believed in what I was saying, I wasn't hurt by it either. What the worst thing that someone said to me in relation to that, there were thousands of comments on this thing about how I was this whore, was a slut, I should keep my legs closed, blah, 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 blah. But the worst one that someone said, which was actually, it was so bad that it circled back round to just being meaningless, was someone said, I'm surprised she managed to get pregnant once, let alone twice. She's as ugly as a dead dog on the side of the road. And I was like, that is so weirdly specific, that how can you possibly be upset by that? How can I possibly be upset by someone who sat down and crafted such a specific insult?
Right.
And so from that point, there was kind of like a baptism of fire. So from that point, I also knew that there's a whole suite of words and insults that are used against women who challenge the status quo.
Sure.
That they don't mean anything. There's only so many times you can be called a fat cunt before you're like, okay, all right, well, I'm going to keep writing, because I know what the purpose is, and the purpose is to shame me into silence. That's how it's always worked with women. That is what will resonate with women reading this book. Even if they think they know it all, they'll be like, yes, I have experienced this fear of being silenced every time I speak up. So what I hope that for women reading it, that they'll be like, I can be, it doesn't sound like your wife needs it. She's pretty brave, it sounds like, but other women can be like, I can have that fire next time. I can speak my mind. And it doesn't matter if someone says this, like the word, maybe it's not this hugely terrifying thing to have a man say that he thinks that I'm ugly. Who cares? Because once women liberate themselves from the fear of what men think of us, we actually can do and say whatever we want. Well, obviously, I mean, that's within reason. We still have to worry about violence, but we're no longer then being active agents in our own silencing by saying, I'm not going to say this thing because I'm afraid.
Right. And speaking of afraid and some of the violence. Oh, wait, well, hold on. Before we move on to that, you mentioned the thing about, so one of your controversial tweets. And again, it's kind of like, I'm like, this is why I asked earlier, somewhat sarcastically, does anybody actually ever address the argument you're making? Because if all you're going to get is rape and death threats, well, then shoot all men into the sun seems like a pretty reasonable response to me, because whatever, nobody's listening to, people are listening to you, but no, none of these people are listening to what you're saying anyway. It doesn't matter. And yet you're told, because, everyone knows women can't be funny. So therefore you weren't joking. I'm going to put you
I must be deadly serious.
I'm going to put you on a spot here, because this was just earlier tonight. So I know nothing about this person other than he wrote an article about you last, I don't know, May or June, guy named Joe Hildebrand. Oh, yes. God. So, I mean, I'm sorry. I'm just going to go out on a limb. I might be putting my foot in my mouth here, but what a walking pile of mediocrity this guy is. I was reading his column about you. Apparently his whole point was, no, Clementine Ford should not be canceled in spite of how controversial and aggressive and pointed and blah, blah, blah. And I'm just like, okay, somebody clearly got a book of adjectives for their birthday, because you haven't addressed what she said. You're just describing her in your opinion, but I don't even think he's reacting to, again, what you said. And he's talking about how, like, either you believe in free speech as I do, and or you believe in censorship and sanitization, I think was his word. And I'm just like, what a grade school view, what an elementary school view of the Constitution or of the concept of free speech. It's like, no, you're allowed to say something, and I'm allowed to say you're an asshole. That's free speech. If I don't like what you're selling, I don't have to buy it. That's the free market. And he's talking about how cancel culture is the tool of the authoritarian left. Bitch, please. The religious right was trying to cancel heavy metal music in the 70s, Dungeons and Dragons in the 80s, and Harry Potter in the 90s. Of course, they love J.K. Rowling now, because she's this huge
absolutely.
Suddenly she's their favorite author. How their morals change? But like I have a friend she's would be, I haven't talked to her in a while, they moved to Milwaukee, but she'd be exactly the type that would talk about cancel culture. And yet when J.K. Rowling said Dumbledore was gay, she threw out her Harry Potter books. And I'm going like, why is it only called that when we do it? But so, I mean, I'm just reading this guy's article, and I'm just like, oh my God, this is a guy who's championing for meritocracy. But anyway, but he brings up that exact tweet about how COVID-19 isn't killing men quickly enough, which obviously is a joke, is a sarcastic point.
Well, let me explain it. Let me explain it, because it wasn't like that tweet, and I'll clarify that, like, what I'm offering is context here. I don't stand by that tweet. It was definitely the wrong thing to tweet. But
right. Well, you did officially apologize for it, which I don't want to say surprised, but I'm curious about that. So tell us a little bit about this.
Well, I'm offering the context of it because it's so often just presented as like a standalone tweet, which makes it seem like I just got on Twitter one day and was like, I'm going to tweet something hilarious, here's a joke. And it actually wasn't like that. It was still like a very misjudged thing to say, but it was part of a longer tweet thread that started with an article that was shared in the Lily last year. And the article was about how women's domestic workload had increased significantly since COVID. We don't call it coronavirus anymore, do we? Since COVID, because they obviously, like, they were being forced to stay home and childcare was closed. So all of these women who'd been working were suddenly like charged because of the domestic inequality that exists as a result of patriarchy.
Right.
All of these women were being charged with abandoning their work, taking care of the children while men continued to work, in some cases because men men that they were partnered with made more money. So, quote unquote, it just made more sense. But the article that
which of course has nothing to do with
patriarchy, the article led with, which really infuriated me, was an example of exactly. The article led with a story of a woman who had been the CEO of her own company, and her husband, I mean, they seem to be like a fairly cashed up kind of tech couple from San Francisco, from memory. But the husband had, prior to COVID, taken a sabbatical from work. So he was at home ostensibly with the child, but the child was in, they had a 3-year-old son, and the child was in childcare some part of the week. When COVID hit, and she began to work from home and childcare was closed, it took 3 days for him to come to her and say, I can't do this. And so the decision that they came up with together as a couple, as a white, liberal, privileged couple, was that she would quit her job and get rid of her company so that she could stay at home and care for this child.
Eddie here, just a quick interjection. I just want to go on record. I'm going to borrow a term from toxic masculinity and just go on record saying that, in my humble opinion, that is not how a, quote, real man behaves.
Right.
And I was so incensed by this and infuriated by the broader contextual impact that was happening on women, and that, all of these articles I was reading about how quarantine and isolation and lockdowns were going to have a more significant impact on women's economic freedoms, which, as we know, when women lose power economically, they also lose power socially, and they also, the risk of violence against them in domestic scenarios is increased too.
Right.
So I tweeted this thread out that was enraged about the domestic inequality that COVID was exposing. And then so angry was I that I said, honestly, the coronavirus isn't killing men fast enough, which, the other thing as well to think about, I mean, it was sort of like a howl of rage. It was hyperbolic.
Yeah, of course.
But what I realized the next day, so someone the next day said to me, I was in a group on Facebook that had, has a mixture of Americans and Australian women in it. And I'd mentioned
Right.
this tweet and the backlash that had come from it. And a Black woman actually in America, and I mentioned that she's Black specifically because obviously Black people have been disproportionately
Yes.
targeted by COVID.
Yes.
A Black woman said, I understand the context. I understand what you're trying to say, but the problem is that Corona has actually been killing a lot of men
Right.
in America, and a lot of them are brown and Black men. And I was like, I was ignorant in that I really didn't consider that, obviously, because I'm
Right.
constantly trying to unpack my white privilege and my
Yeah.
white centralization. But also because in Australia, because we're an island and because we were sort of locking down early.
Yeah.
And as I said before, we really didn't have that huge of an impact initially. We only had a handful of cases.
Right.
It was almost like the virus was sort of theoretical for us.
Yeah.
So I didn't have, I want to believe that were I living in a society, or I was living in a community where thousands of people were being admitted to hospital, that I wouldn't have even thought of making that tweet,
Right.
of writing that tweet.
Yeah.
But it sort of seemed kind of very distanced for me at the time. And so then I came back and I said, I've actually thought about this and I've talked about it with people, and I've realized that this was an unacceptable thing to say. Normally I would justify making a joke about shooting men into the sun or whatever, because it's so clearly hyperbolic,
Right.
and so clearly not reflective of reality. But as this person has helped me realize, obviously reality right now is that a lot of men are being killed by this virus, and that makes this joke, or that makes this comment unacceptable in the way that you could normally say, well, I'm using satire to prove a point.
Yeah. But there is a big difference, though, let's acknowledge, between a Black woman saying, hang on a second, this is how that intersects with my experience, and some white dude tone policing you. which is entirely right. Because he points out, he's like, this was the weirdest statement too. Because I'm like, what exactly is your point here? He said, I don't have the article up, but it was only a few hours ago. Let's go remember this. It says, medically speaking, the coronavirus has killed more men than women. Maybe she knows this and she's just joking, but let's hope not. Wait, let's hope she's not joke. Did you even proofread that? What? Let's hope she's not joking. Like, what does that even mean? Like, oh my God. So anyway, but when you mentioned earlier,
I feel like
tweet, I wanted to bring that up.
It's one that kind of I regret writing for a number of reasons.
Yeah.
The most significant of which is that it was morally the wrong thing to say.
Right.
But I also feel like it's, without wanting to sound like I am an amazing person, because I don't think that at all. But I do find it frustrating that all that we ask for is that people reflect on the things that they say. I'm not saying that anything said is unforgivable. I mean, there are some things actually that are unforgivable, but I think that it's the digging in of the heels that really kind of stops us from moving forward. And I'm happy to own my mistakes. I'm happy to say I've fucked up here. I did this. I made a mistake here, and I've reflected on it. And here's an apology that I think is like demonstrates that process of reflection. And that I think that we should all strive to do as humans living in the world, wanting to learn all the time and wanting to be better. But the thing is that there's actually what I find really frustrating is that there are people who love that I wrote that. They love thinking how offensive it was, because it means then that they can always point to it as like, this is, oh, look at how she hates men. She wants men to die. It's like, you're refusing to even deal with the context of the situation. You're refusing, obviously, to read the apology that I wrote about it.
Right.
You're intellectually not interested in this. You're using it for your own agenda.
Right, exactly. And I mean, you described the thought process and the reflection that you went through and the experience you had, and you had to take other, that whole thing. And then you look at, like, you have a section in Boys Will Be Boys on male comedians. You mentioned Louis C.K. and Tosh.0, or was it Dane Cook? I think it was Tosh.0. And it's like they will make the most vile jokes, the things that cause women to like walk out of the audience, flipping them the bird and heckling them as they leave. And yet, any self-reflection? Nah, she's too sensitive. Fuck her. We'll get on with the set. And it's like, wait a minute. Now,
or it's just unforgivable. Like all Louis C.K. issued a statement. Louis C.K. sexually harassed and, by virtue of masturbating in front of them, sexually assaulted numerous colleagues. Yeah. And denied it for years until he was forced to admit to it because of the expose in the New York Times. And then in his letter, which I'm not even going to call an apology letter, but in his letter of acknowledgement of it, He mentioned again numerous times, 4 times he mentioned how he'd let down people who admired him.
Right.
But not once did he say the word sorry. And I remember tweeting that day, like, Louis C.K. hasn't even said sorry. Like, what is this bullshit? Yeah. And someone replied to me and said, I said something, I tweeted something about Louis C.K. basically being an harasser. Mm-hmm. And someone replied saying, well, he said sorry. What more do you want? And you're like, well, he didn't say sorry. But for a start, a woman could issue a reflective piece saying this one tweet that I wrote was poorly judged for these reasons, and this is what I've learned from it. And people will be like, nope, she's a piece of shit. She said this. She hates men. She wants them all to die. And men can literally be out there sexually assaulting women, not copping to it.
Right.
And then sort of issue like some vague kind of like bullshit statement. And people are like, well, he's apologized. And he's really funny.
Right. And then have the gall to incorporate it into their act in many cases.
Yeah.
To then joke about it afterwards down the road. And it's like, oh my God. So, I mean, but again, it goes back to, of course, you can't be joking because everybody knows women can't be funny. Fuck you, Chris.
No.
Hannah Gadsby, Sarah Milliken, Melissa McCarthy, Sarah Silverman, Joan Crawford, Lily Tomlin, Gilda Radner, Carol Burnett, Vicki Lawrence, and Phyllis Diller at a minimum would like to have a word about that. Fuck you, Hitchens.
Yeah, but also, of course, like, I love all of those comedians too. But of course, men like that are going to say that women aren't funny because they are so uncurious about women's lives. Right. So when women make jokes, they're like, well, I don't get this, and therefore it mustn't be funny. Like, they're so small-minded, And men, a lot of men as well, really struggle to accept that, like when I said, oh, I'm going to shoot men into the sun or something like that. Oh, so that's right. Someone said to me, you won't stop until all men in the world are fired. And I was like, yeah,
into the sun.
Yes. Which is just a silly, like, slapstick joke. But then people were like, she wants to kill men, she wants to shoot them into the sun. It's like, I think what's going on here is actually, like, you genuinely do believe that because you, as a white man, have never, ever been the target of a joke.
Right.
In your conception, it doesn't compute to you that men should ever be the target of a joke, that white men in particular should ever be the target of a joke. So if you hear them being targeted, then it must be deadly serious, or you're just so in your feels about it. Because of course, we know, we keep hearing men are so logical and rational and never get upset about anything. I mean, come on.
No, that's where the whole women are too emotional comes from. It's because anger is not counted as an emotion when it comes from men. Men don't cry because we're told not to. Men don't express certain feelings because we're told not to. We're allowed to lose our tempers. However, women cry, women express affection, women lose their tempers. Oh my God, these emotional women. But it's like, count the number of times that the average guy loses his temper. And I mean, I'm not immune to this. I mean, someone once, would tell me that I'm overly emotional. I'm like, what are you talking about? Then I think about, well, if you count every time I got pissed off and yelled at something or slammed my computer down or something. Yeah, I was clearly being emotional. Yeah, I guess that, wow. Well,
I was thinking, even when you told the story about your father before with your wife, and that, you said by the end of the conversation that because she'd framed it in this way, he respected her for it. And I just thought it's so funny that women still have to frame things in certain ways rather than being obnoxious even, or being what people would call aggressive,
right? Because
otherwise they're too much. Whereas I've been in rooms with men before who were just like wildly aggressive, really unpleasant to be around, very sort of like aggro with their opinions that are not based on fact at all.
Right.
But that's normal. But if I behave like that as a woman, then I'm transgressing somehow.
Right. Well,
and I'm unpleasant to be around.
And you're described by so many people as behaving that way. And it's like, hey, look at this, guys. Here we are having a pleasant conversation. Kind of funny when you're not a douchebag, how easy that can be. It's like, and I'm gonna end with this before I want to talk to you about the new book and about the upcoming show. But you have a chapter on incels, and just again, speaking of certain kinds of men and the violence that a lot of them have perpetrated in terms of school shootings and other things, mass shootings, that sort of thing, at least in America and whatnot. And I mean, look, I grew up in the 80s, and I mean, to me, it's like and I was not the cool kid. I was not the jock. I was every bit as awkward and stupid and fumbling around as everybody else. But I'm like, we didn't cope with that by turning being a loser into a subculture. I mean, we didn't have to have some clever label for I can't get laid. And when I got divorced and I re-entered the dating scene. So when I talk about dating, I'm not talking about the 80s. This isn't an okay boomer moment from 30 years ago, 40 years ago. This is, in the last 5 years, and I'm a middle-aged, fat, balding divorcee with 2 special needs kids. So I'm a prize. But if I can do it, guys, and you can't, that's a you problem. Okay, because I had no problem, meeting women, dating women. I did have some relationships, some ended. I'm now getting married. I'm now married. So, it's like if I could do that, there's no reason that anybody can't do that. Especially like, again, what I wouldn't give to be 17 again and have the body I had at 17, but the brain I have now. Oh my God, But I'm struck by how misogynistic they are, and what the way that this whole, and you describe it brilliantly in the book, and anybody who's been down this rabbit hole on YouTube, it's you just have to wash afterwards. They're groomed to hate women, hate feminism. It's like, guys, what you need more than anything else is feminism. I'm going to tell you, even if it's just cynically being able to use the right words from time to time, but immerse yourself in it, you're going to meet a lot of women. It's like, maybe just try not hating every single woman that comes across. You might find you do a little bit better. I mean, but as I read these guys railing against feminism and blaming women for all their problems, and I'm just like, what you're doing right now is your biggest roadblock. Like, let's face it, they're not interested in self-improvement. They're interested in being angry and lashing out with toxically masculine power fantasies.
This is what I think that everyone should be, I'm not necessarily saying that they need to like lead with being afraid of it, but we need to accept, particularly if we are parents of boys, we need to accept that the world that we are raising them in is so different to the one that we were socialized in. We didn't have access to social media. Right. We didn't have access to subcultures that were, like connected with tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of other people around the world. We had the subcultures at our school.
Right. Right. The darker side of social media, because you talk about how you had the opportunity to connect with so many amazing people, but yet a vulnerable young person has the opportunity to be connected to so many toxic people. And so there's that trade-off that's made.
Yeah. I think that anyone who's interested in this should listen to the New York Times podcast Rabbit Hole, because it's about the radicalization of young men and young white men in particular on the internet.
Yeah.
And it's not something that we're talking about a little bit more these days, but it's not something that has historically ever been kind of because of white supremacy and because of patriarchy. It's not been something that's ever been really addressed seriously as a risk group, because of course white men are given the privilege of being treated like individuals rather than representatives of an entire group when they perpetrate acts of violence.
And now,
the incel thing in particular,
the
incel thing in particular really concerns me, obviously, because it gives rise to so much violence or potential violence against, groups of people. And we've just seen in Plymouth, the 22-year-old guy, go on a massacre and before shooting himself because, as he said, he felt, entitled to a girlfriend and he didn't have one. And he was a virgin, and how dare he be a virgin? I mean, this is like extreme entitlement.
Right.
But the thing that really, I'm furious about it, and I'm enraged at the misogyny, and I'm disgusted at the culture that produces that. But I also have a sliver of humanity in there, or I have a sliver of like,
he was hurt. He was a victim of that. As much as his
no. I don't. I mean, I think we need to be really careful about that, because that tends to also be something. It tends to be a consideration that we give to people, particularly young white men. We look enough. For like how they're. We look to how they're.
You become Brock Turner pretty quickly if you go down that path. That's true. Yeah. All right. Fair enough. Take that back.
I think that we should look at go back and look at all what are we teaching little boys in culture? What representations are we giving them of girls? Why do we still not have enough stories in which girls not just are the leads, but also aren't just one woman in the room, like the Smurfette kind of thing?
Yeah.
Why don't we have, it is improving, but we really need to address this entitlement that men have to women as a means of elevating their status amongst other men. And this is what I think that people don't really talk enough about, is that, there's this brilliant Marilyn Fry quote. I'm just going to look it up.
Mm-hmm.
Marilyn Fry is a feminist who wrote, and this may be challenging for some people to hear, but I would urge you to kind of like sit there and ruminate on it.
Right.
She talks about the politics of heterosexuality being inherently man-loving. To say that straight men are heterosexual is only to say that they engage in sex, fucking exclusively with the other sex, i.e. women. All or almost all of that which pertains to love, most straight men reserve exclusively for other men. The people whom they admire, respect, adore, revere, honor, whom they imitate, idolize, and form profound attachments to, whom they are willing to teach and from whom they are willing to learn, and whose respect, admiration, recognition, honor, reverence, and love they desire, those are overwhelmingly other men. In their relations with women, what passes for respect is kindness, generosity, or paternalism. What passes for honor is removal to the pedestal. From women, they want devotion, service, and sex. Heterosexual male culture is homoerotic. It is man-loving, which is not to say that all straight men are secretly gay. That's a very reductive reading of that. But I think it does reflect that what I said earlier about patriarchy co-opting men into this allegiance with each other, where the only role that women really play in that, broadly and culturally speaking, is to affirm men's masculinity to other men.
Right.
So men exist on a hierarchy with other men. They understand at some level, they understand their place in the male hierarchy. As you kind of like made jokes about yourself about how you were in school, you weren't a jock or whatever. You implicitly understand that the jock sits on top of the hierarchy.
Right.
And men, what patriarchy does to men, and one of the harms that patriarchy does to men, is place them on that hierarchy with other men, so that they don't feel like they have to measure up to women. They feel like women, that the existence of women in their life and the devotion of women allows them to measure up to other men.
Right.
These are the things that we need to unpack. And we need to say that for men to have status in the world, they don't need to compete with other men for that status. That what is status anyway? Why is status for men having beautiful women on their arms?
Right.
Like, that's so redundant.
Right. Well, and that's a great segue, talking about men's love for other men. Let's talk a little bit about love. Let's talk a little bit about the book that's coming out. Tell me what this is all about.
Yeah, so it's a very different book to the first two, in that they're purely just personal essays. As I write in the introduction, there's no research involved in this book. They are just really just me reflecting on moments in my life. So the book is called How We Love, and it's an exploration of the ways in which love presents itself in our life, how it emboldens us, how it liberates us, how it hurts us, and how ultimately being able to love and experience love in all of its forms makes us more human. And that is why we keep striving to find it. So I write about the death of my mother and what it was like to reflect on my childhood with her, and what it means to say goodbye to your maternal figure. Even, I was 25 when she died. What are the things that you want to say now? I talk about, there is some romance stuff in there, obviously. I talk about leaving my son's father, and the relationship that we have now as co-parents, and why it's really reductive to sort of like see the pinnacle of love or the achievement of love in the world as being purely romantic, that what we need to achieve in order to somehow be valid and somehow like experience happiness is to find someone to marry and have children with and be with for the rest of our lives. Because actually the relationship that I have with him now as co-parents, he's still very much my family.
Right.
I still love him. He's one of my best friends. Our family is stronger now than it was when we were together. And that is a valid form of love.
Yeah.
There's stories in the book about having your heart broken, and having your heart broken in really mundane ways, and sometimes really like tedious ways, but still sort of opening yourself up, I guess, to this experience of humanity, and what is it that we can learn from it. So it's a very personal exploration. I feel like it gives a completely different insight into who I am. But in many ways, it's a very natural companion to those first two books, because I think that in order to do the work that I do, and in order to fight in the way that I have to kind of be primed to fight all the time, and to sort of weather, I guess, the backlash that comes from being a public feminist, you actually can't be a cold, emotionless person. I feel like you have to be a very warm, loving person, because that's the motivation for why you do it. You want the world to be a better place. You want humans to be better in that place. And that comes from a place of love. The reason that I'm a feminist is because I love women. And the reason that I'm a feminist is because I love men. And I want us all to be liberated from the things that want to hurt us.
I can't think of a better way to go out. Clementine, thanks so much for coming on the program. I really appreciate you giving me so much of your time.
It's been so great to talk to you. I really appreciate it. It was so nice to get your email. It's lovely to think that people across the world and men across the world are reading my book. So thank you so much. It's been great. It's been really good to chat to you, and I can't wait for it to be up.
I'd like to thank Clementine again for coming on the program. I had a great time talking to her. I'd like to give the recommendation to everyone out there to check out her books, Fight Like a Girl and Boys Will Be Boys, both available on Amazon and anywhere else that books are sold. As always, if you have any questions or comments about anything you've heard here tonight, first of all, may I please request that you only question or comment something you actually did, in fact, hear here tonight. Because of all the guests I've had, I think nobody I've ever seen so often misquoted and misrepresented as Clementine Ford. But, as always, if you do have any questions or comments about anything you've heard here tonight, or suggestions for future shows, guests, or topics, please feel free to email me at niceguy9418@usa.com. You can friend me on Facebook at Eddie Cabot. You can tweet me at NiceGuyEddie Cab. Nice Guy Eddie has a YouTube channel as well, for In My Humble Opinion. You can find me there, leave a comment there. You can also leave a comment on my blog at eddiecabot.blogspot.com. Thank you for listening. I hope you enjoy the rest of your evening, and keep it tuned to Rainbow Radio.